You are dismissed. Good morning, everybody. Sophia, nice to have you back. Okay, let's turn in our Bibles to Job 13. And before we get started, are there any unanswered questions hanging out there in your minds? Everything is crystal clear. That's fantastic. Okay, if you will recall where we ended last week with chapter 12, Job is in the midst of a fairly lengthy speech. He's replying to, well, I shouldn't say it. He's not just replying to Zophar, who is his friend who made the previous speech, but he's really addressing all three of his friends together. And you may recall that Zophar's speech against Job was pretty harsh, very uncomplimentary, to say the least. And Job is offended, and I think we could say rightly so. But nevertheless, here we are in sort of in the middle of Job's speech, chapter 13. And Lord willing, we'll get through chapter 14 today. Okay, we'll be here next Sunday, and then that following Sunday is when we have our conference. So we'll not have our regular Sunday school then, and then we'll have our guest speaker doing Sunday school. And I think after that, we might have 3 Sundays left, if I'm remembering correctly. But we're not going to be finished with the book of Job by the end of this quarter. We'll only be finished, hopefully, with chapter 19. And Job part 2 will come at some future date. Okay, Job 13, beginning in verse 1. Behold, this is Job speaking. Behold, my eye has seen all this, my ear has heard and understood it. What you know, I also know. I am not inferior to you, but I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to argue my case with God. As for you, you whitewash with lies. Worthless physicians are you all. Oh, that you would keep silent, and it would be your wisdom. Hear now my argument and listen to the pleading of my lips. Will you speak falsely for God and speak deceitfully for him? Will you show partiality toward him? Will you plead the case for God? Will it be well with you when he searches you out? Or can you deceive him as one deceives a man? He will surely rebuke you if in secret you show partiality. Will not his majesty terrify you, and the dread of him fall upon you? Your maxims are proverbs of ashes. Your defenses are defenses of clay. So let me just stop there for a moment. Here we have Job responding basically to Zophar, and as I said, the others too are sort of all included together. And Job is telling him, you're not telling me anything I don't already know. He says, I'm not inferior to you, to say the least. He knows just as much as they do, although they think that they know more than Job. I think at this point we could probably observe that Job is his greater understanding than his friends. He's more attuned to the mysteries of how God operates, whereas his friends think they've got God all figured out, and they can check the boxes and say that this is true about God, this is not true about God, and so on. But Job's understanding of God and who he is and how he operates in the world is in a period of growth. He's increasing his understanding, especially compared to his friends. Verse 5, Job says, "Oh, that you would keep silent." It's sort of like thinking back when his friends first came to visit him. They didn't say anything for 7 days, and that was probably the best, their best time together with Job. They didn't say anything foolish because they didn't say anything. They just kept quiet, and Job wishes that they would go back and do that again. He also accuses his friends of speaking falsely for God. His friends think that they're doing God a favor by defending God to Job, because they think that Job has said some wrong things concerning God, and that is true. Think back to chapter 3, when Job was wishing he was dead or had never been born. And so Job accuses his friends of speaking falsely on the part of God, as if God needs their words to defend him before Job. And Job points out that they're doing God no favor. God doesn't need their help anyway, but certainly the response of Job's friends is not helpful to them or to Job, and it's not honoring to the Lord either. One thing to notice here is that Job says in verse 3, I desire to argue my case with God. So, in other words, Job wants his friends to shut up because they have nothing good or helpful to say, and he wants to take his case to God. Remember a few chapters back, Job is kind of working his way around this idea of bringing his case to the Lord, but then recall he kind of gives up in despair, says, well, I really need somebody on my team, so to speak, to come between me and God and settle our dispute. That would be great if there was such a person, but then he concludes that there is no such person. There's no one to come and mediate this situation between him and the Lord. But now Job is once again coming around to this idea of presenting his case to God as if we're in a court of law, and Job is going to act as his own defense attorney before the judge, who is God. So this is a change for the better on Job's part. He says, I don't want you friends of mine. I don't even want to talk to you anymore because you're no help for me. I'll just go directly to the Lord and not take it through you and for you, my friends, to defend God. And then he says in verse 9, if you are examined thoroughly by God, how will you come out in that examination? I mean, you're full of criticisms for me, what I've said, what you imagine that I've done. But nevertheless, um, I need to go directly to the source. One commentator makes an interesting point here that he contrasts Job's behavior and attitude with that of Adam after Adam had sinned. And this commentator writes, guilty Adam had hidden from the parousia of his judge, meaning the appearance of his judge. Remember what happened when God came calling Adam and Eve in the garden. They went to hide themselves. But innocent Job let it be known that he had no intention of behaving like Adam if ever God would grant his request for a fair trial. In verse 3, Job says that he wants to reason with God, or some translations say to argue with God, or in the ESV and the NIV both, they say argue my case with God. So that translation that the ESV translators decided to use makes it more clear to us that this is kind of like a judicial proceeding, that Job just doesn't want a simple discussion with God about this, that, and the other thing, but he wants to present his case because Job believes that he is innocent. So he's not afraid right now of God. He has a certain amount of confidence that God might listen to him and judge rightly. As I pointed out last week, we see, constantly throughout the book of Job, and we certainly see it here, his changing mood. Sometimes he'll be confident. If I can just get God to listen to me, I'll present my case, he'll understand. And then, 5 minutes later, he's down in the dumps again and kind of throwing his hands up and not confident at all that God is going to do the right thing by him. But he wants to bring his case to the Lord, and we have indications throughout the Old Testament that this is something that God actually wants his people to do. Look at Isaiah 1:18, where God indicates his desire to reason together with his people and to heal them from their sins. Or we could look at Isaiah 43:26. God says to Israel, let us contend together, state your case that you may be acquitted. Or other translations say, let us argue the matter together, state the case for your innocence. So this idea of God meeting with his people to discuss something that has gone amiss, whether it's in Job's case, the suffering that he's enduring, or looking at what the prophet Isaiah says for the whole nation, which has fallen into disobedience and sin. God wants to talk with his people. He wants his people to explain themselves in so many words. Questions, comments? Okay. Let's look at starting in, let me see here, verse 13. Let me have silence and I will speak, and let come on me what may. Why should I take my flesh in my teeth and put my life in my hand? That take my flesh in my teeth phrase is one of those statements in Job that translators can't figure out what that means exactly, but there it is. And then verse 15, though he slay me, speaking of God here, I will hope in him. Or depending on your translation, it might say, should he slay, though he slays me, I will trust in him. So this particular statement by Job is actually quite remarkable. This statement of his truly profound trust in God, even if God should wind up killing him. If at the end of this whole process that Job is going through, if it results in his death because God finally puts him to death, Job is saying he's still going to trust in the Lord. That would not be enough to drive Job away from the God in whom he is putting his trust. Verse 16, this will be my salvation, that the godless shall not come before him, meaning God. Keep listening to my words and let my declaration be in your ears. Behold, I have prepared my case. I know that I shall be in the right. Who is there who will contend with me? For then I would be silent and die. Only grant me two things. Right now he kind of directs his attention to God alone. He's speaking directly to God now. He says, only grant me two things, that I will not hide myself from your face. Withdraw your hand far from me, and let not dread of you terrify me. Then call, and I will answer, or let me speak, and you reply to me. How many are my iniquities and my sins? Make me know my transgression and my sin. Why do you hide your face and count me as your enemy? Will you frighten a driven leaf and pursue dry chaff? For you write bitter things against me and make me inherit the iniquities of my youth. You put my feet in the stocks and watch all my paths. You set a limit for the soles of my feet. Man wastes away like a rotten thing, like a garment that is moth. So, here we have this combination of confidence in the Lord, trust in the Lord no matter what, and at the same time complaining at the way God is treating him. Job compares himself to a dry leaf that just kind of blows around, and in so many words he's saying to God, why are you paying so much attention to me? Why don't you just leave me alone? I'm no better than a dried up leaf that is blowing down the road. So here we have this not atypically this kind of mixed messages coming from Job, that he trusts in the Lord, but yet he's frustrated with God and afraid of God in many ways. William Henry Green, who is he was a professor at Princeton Seminary back in the 1900s. I've referred to his commentary on Job in the past, and he has some very insightful observations to make. For one thing, he says, meaning Job, seems to outward view to have no ground left to stand upon. It would seem as though everything conspired to show God was persecuting him and treating him as an enemy. Yet from an angry God, he can turn nowhere but back to God himself, in whom he does and must confide in spite of God's apparent hostility. Green says, God is still Job's only refuge, even from the fierceness of God's own displeasure. So he says that the question here is for us to consider, and for Job in his trial, was not whether he was going to be able to pull himself up by his bootstraps, so to speak, but whether he would continue to trust in God in spite of his circumstances, which are horrible. Think back on what Satan accused Job of, thinking back to that initial interaction between the Lord and Satan, and what was Satan's argument back at that time? What did he say? Right. If God takes away all the goodies that he's given to Job over the years, Job is going to curse him, because Job is only in it for the money, so to speak. But if there's no tangible benefit for Job, Satan says Job is going to desert the Lord. So in light of Job's suffering, Green points out, human reason alone, logic alone, would dictate that this is what Job should be doing at this point. Job's got nothing. He's suffering. He's still sitting on the garbage dump there outside of the city. And there is, his faithfulness to God is not giving him any kind of reward. He's miserable. So Satan, for all his bluster, so far seems to be losing this contest. There's no indication that Job is going to give up on God and look for answers to his problems somewhere else. Yes, Maureen. Yeah. Yeah, there's no, think about Job when he lived. I believe that he lived during the patriarchal period. That makes by far the most sense. So he's a contemporary of Abraham, give or take a couple hundred years. There's no indication that God's people have an understanding of the theology of testing that we have in the New Testament. I mean, over and over again, it's in the New Testament that is a very real thing, and that we as Christians should expect that we're going to be tested, that God is going to discipline us, as the writer to Hebrews says, just as a father disciplines his son because he loves his son, so God is going to discipline you and test you because he loves you. Well, we know that standing where we are in redemptive history, but there's no indication that those kinds of actions on God's part have been communicated in any way, whether in writing or otherwise. We have to assume, I think, that the book of Job was written, or the events of the book of Job took place before there was scripture that had been written down. So, Job knows a lot. He knows an amazing amount, actually, given the time in which he lived. but he doesn't know everything. And there is much as far as God's truth that has yet to be revealed to God's people. And so Job can't figure it out. It's going back to that retribution theology that when you do wrong, you're going to be punished. When you do what is right, God is going to bless you. And there's plenty of stuff throughout the Old Testament and in the New Testament that corroborate those very things. Yes, if you are faithful and you keep God's commandments, imperfectly, of course, God will bless you. That is a promise. But when we think of Paul writing that God works out all things for the good of those who love him, that doesn't mean that all those things that he is working out are good. Some of those things that God is using to sanctify us and cause us to grow can be very unpleasant while we're going through them. So this is where, Maureen, last week I did bring up the point that where we are so far in Job's struggle is that he is yet to ask God to restore all of his material wealth or to restore his family. In fact, we know that he hasn't asked for those things. All he wants is for his formerly good relationship with the Lord to be restored. And actually, he still is in a good relationship with the Lord, but he can't see that right now. I mean, all the bad stuff is just too overwhelming. One more comment by Green that I think is helpful to us is he writes this: reason and sense urged Job in one direction, and the strong recoil of faith drives him back in the other, and thus he swayed perpetually to and fro. So this is something that we've observed already, that Job is all over the place as far as his attitudes. Sometimes he's extremely pessimistic. Other times he seems to have hope and that the Lord is going to treat him right. So back and forth constantly. And I think we can imagine if we were in Job's place, we would probably be acting in the same way as fallen human beings, trying to figure out what God is doing, because he's not acting like we assume that he's going to. And so sometimes we're afraid of him, sometimes we recognize that we have nowhere else to go but to cling to the Lord. And this is the kind of behavior that we keep seeing over and over again with Job. So anyway, Job is wanting to bring his case to present to God so that God will acquit him, because Job is confident that he is going to present a strong case. God is just, after all. Job has said as much, so have Job's friends. They recognize that God is perfectly just and righteous, and he's always going to do what is perfectly right and just. And so Job is in one of those periods now on that pendulum swinging back and forth. He's sort of in a positive frame of mind, but that is also subject to change at any given moment. Job wants to know who can bring charges against him, who will contend with me. He says, I know that I'm in the right and I will be vindicated, looking at verses 17, 18, and 19. We think of Paul writing, who will charge the elect who will accuse us. Well, we could say it would be Satan. He is the accuser of God's elect, but of course Paul tells us in Romans 8 that nothing can separate us from the love of God. We don't need to worry about these attacks that might be coming to us from other people or spiritual forces or Satan, that God's love is not going to let us go. So anyway, Job wants to present his case. If you're familiar with the book of Job, back in chapters 29 through 31, are where Job presents sort of like his final defense, where he goes through all of the actions that have typified his life, all of the good things that he always used to do when he was a wealthy man, when he was a man of honor and respect. He presents his case. So this desire that he has to do that here, that we're not quite halfway through the book, eventually that does happen. Job does present his case before the Lord and before his friends as well. Let me see. Any questions or comments regarding chapter 13 before we move on?
As far as comments go, I like when Job calls his three friends, who Howard refers to as very curly and low. He worthless physicians,
Yeah.
to which I say touche. But his Job's first line, if he just ended it there, period, full stop, it would be very good. And I know this thing went out of the
Right.
the guy that people's eye to try to defend himself, but as you had said also, he hasn't read the New Testament yet.
He has not.
Where it says, all our righteousness is as filthy rags.
Right.
There is none righteous, no, not one. He was trying to defend his righteousness.
Yeah, when we get to chapter 19, toward the end of that chapter, of course, is the very famous statement that Job makes. He says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the end, he will come to me. I will see him face to face, even after I'm dead. I will see him face to face. And that would be another great stopping point in the book. Right. And you would think that at that point, Job really gets it. Unbelievable depth of understanding that he has at that point, and confidence in God. But that's not obvious. That's not even halfway through the book when he makes that statement, and he says a lot of other foolish things throughout the rest of the book. So again, it's showing his true humanity. He can express deep and profound and true theological thoughts. It shows that his understanding is pretty phenomenal at times, and then he can turn around and say something foolish, and he's feeling sorry for himself, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So just as we do ourselves, and probably without the depth of understanding that Job has exhibited. Okay, let's get started on chapter 14. I'm definitely not going to finish it today because there's a lot of pretty amazing stuff here, very interesting and profound, but we'll see how far we get. Starting in verse 1 of Job 14, This is Job still speaking, man who is born of a woman is few of days and full of trouble. He comes out like a flower and withers. He flees like a shadow and continues not. And do you open your eyes on such a one and bring me into judgment with you? He's obviously speaking directly to God here. Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? There is not one, since his days are determined and the number of his months is with you. And you have appointed his limits that he cannot pass. Look away from him and leave him alone, that he may enjoy like a hired hand his day. So here Job is kind of down in the dumps again. He is addressing the reality that human beings have lives that are hard. They suffer. Their days are few and full of trouble, he says. And Job is not just speaking for himself now, but sort of all human beings. Why can't God just leave them alone instead of paying so much attention to them? Here in this chapter, which is about pretty important stuff, matters of life and death, he recognizes that our days are predetermined, the number of months that we can live. God knows what those will be. We do not. Similar to what the Apostle Paul has to say, that the Lord has determined our exact number of days that we will be living in this world. So Job is many hundreds of years ahead of Paul there in affirming that reality. But anyway, in this chapter where Job is going to talk about life and death, there's also something new that comes into the conversation, which is the question of life after death. Is that a possibility? We could say that is something that is, I would think, would be unexpected at this point in the book. It's really not something that we see coming, but it is indeed something that Job is going to start to explore and meditate on, wonder about. Job questions God here in verse 3. It's interesting, even though some of the things that Job says about God seem somewhat aggressive, lacking respect, maybe too bold, perhaps, for anybody to speak to God in the way that Job does speak to him sometimes. But Job is nevertheless speaking to God, whereas Job's friends speak about God in sort of more of a theoretical way of thinking of him, but they don't address God directly as Job does. So I think that's indicative of a certain amount of a deeper knowledge that Job believes that he can speak very candidly to God the way that he does, the way that is not typical, I would say. But nevertheless, Job here is asking God questions, very direct questions, and almost telling God what he should be doing in verse 6, which is to look away from those who are suffering and not pay so much attention to him. So here we go, starting in verse 7, and I'll read through verse 17. Here, Job says, "For there is hope for a tree if it be cut down, that it will sprout again, and that its shoots will not cease, though its root grow old in the earth and its stump die in the soil. Yet at the scent of water it will bud and put out branches like a young plant. But a man dies and is laid low. Man breathes his last, and where is he? As waters fail from a lake and a river wastes away and dries up, so a man lies down and rises not again, till the heavens are no more. He will not awake or be roused out of his sleep. So here Job is ruminating about life and reality, and he's observing the way what gardeners know. If you prune a plant, it will sprout new buds, growth will be stimulated, and the plant will be healthier from being properly pruned. But even beyond that, if a tree is cut down completely, and so all you have there is a dead stump, supposedly, nevertheless, at some point, the tree will sprout new buds and new life will arise from what seemed to be just a dead tree stump. So if this can happen for plants, if it can happen for a tree, well, how about for a man? Why is it that plants will sprout again, but when a man dies, that's it? Or is it? Maybe not. Then he says in verse 13, speaking to the Lord again, "Oh, that you would hide me in Sheol, that you would conceal me until your wrath be past, that you would appoint me a set time and remember me. If a man dies, shall he live again? All the days of my service I would wait till my renewal should come. You would call, and I would answer you. You would long for the work of your hands." I'll read these last two verses also. "For then you would number my steps. You would not keep watch over my sin. My transgression would be sealed up in a bag, and you would cover over my iniquity." So let's just talk about this first statement concerning the possibility of resurrection that Job makes here in verse 13. He's asking, Sheol is sort of the generic term for the place of the dead, for believers and unbelievers alike at this point in redemptive history. There has not been revelation given to the people of Job's day concerning the possibility of resurrection, and we see the same thing even much later in the Psalms. There's not a well-developed theology of life after death. But here Job asks to be hidden in Sheol, the place of the dead, asking God to conceal me until your wrath be past. So Job obviously thinks he's suffering because God is angry with him. So he's saying, well, if I could just hide out in the place of the dead for a while God is venting his anger and wrath, could I be hidden there, almost as if God wouldn't know exactly where Job was now, or maybe God would forget about Job and leave him alone until his anger has been expended, so he's not mad at Job anymore. And then he asks if God would appoint a set time at which point God would remember Job. And then second half of verse 14, "All the days of my service I would wait." So Job is saying, I am willing to wait patiently for you, God, while you get this. It's almost like, get it out of your system so you won't be angry with me anymore. And it doesn't matter how long that might be. He's willing to wait. And then he says, till my renewal should come. So he's already talking about being dead. God has hidden him away in Sheol. He's dead. But then he's also saying, I would wait till my renewal should come. Now, what kind of renewal is there for a dead person? Shouldn't be anything. But Job is, it's sort of like he's working this out in his own mind, trying to follow his logic here. So when God appoints a time for Job to sort of come back to the land of the living again, Job says, you would call and I would answer you. You would long for the work of your hands. So Job is hoping, trusting that if at some point God is no longer angry with him, if all the anger has been worked out and it's gone, that God then would want to see Job again. He says, you would long for the work of your hands. So it's almost like Job is thinking, well, maybe if I'm sort of out of the picture for a while, God will kind of miss me and bring me back, and that previous relationship that we had together that was so positive, that can be restored again, that God would long for the work of his hands. Quite an amazing few statements here being made by Job, where he seems to be hoping for a resurrection from the dead. So, chapter 19 is, of course, the very well-known chapter concerning resurrection and life after death. But it's not the first place, actually, that we see that subject being brought up here in the book of Job. Here we find it in chapter 14. So in verse 14, the question in our ESV is asked, if a man dies, shall he live again? Interestingly enough, in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, this statement is not rendered as a question, but as a clear assertion on the part of Job that yes, man will live again. It's a statement of fact. If a man, in other words, if a man dies, he will live again. And I'm certainly not enough of a scholar to know why the people who translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, why they took a different path here in the translation. But nevertheless, there it is. It's not a question, but a statement. And other alternate translations of the verse are, one is that if only a man might die and live again. So it's not a question, and it's not a statement of fact or inevitability, but it's sort of wishful thinking on the part of Job, in that it's like he doesn't believe it, but boy, wouldn't it be great if it was true. But that is a minority opinion there on how that verse should be rendered. I think we need to stop there. Any questions, comments? Well, why don't you ask me once we break, because people probably want coffee or something similar. John DeConti, can I ask you to close us in prayer?
Lord God, we're grateful to you that through the completed work of